February 26th, 2022. That's the day everything changed when Western leaders thought they just dropped the ultimate financial nuke by cutting 7 Russian banks completely off from SWIFT and freezing $300 billion in reserves overnight. The ruble tanked 30% in 2 days, and everyone was celebrating across CNN, BBC, and every major outlet saying Russia's done and they'll collapse in months. Except that's not what happened, because 3 years later Russia's economy is actually growing faster than Germany's. The ruble came back completely, and over 50 countries are now scrambling to build their own payment systems because when America froze $300 billion with basically a phone call, every single finance minister on the planet had the same thought that we could be next. Look, this isn't new, because this exact pattern has played out 4 times in the last 100 years, and every single time it's the same story with short-term pain for whoever gets hit, but long-term destruction for the weapon itself. Britain pulled this move in 1914, and by 1944 they'd lost everything with reserve currency status gone, and it took 30 years. America hit the button in 2022, and if history's any guide, dollar dominance ends around 2042. Maybe sooner because the alternatives already exist this time, and technology moves way faster now than it did back then. What I'm about to show you is this 5-stage pattern that happens every time someone weaponizes money. The actual data proving it's happening right now, like today. Why China's basically won without firing a shot. And the exact timeline for when the dollar loses its grip, because that SWIFT weapon didn't hurt Russia, but instead destroyed the foundation of American power, and the clock's already ticking. Most people think SWIFT is like a bank, but it's not, because SWIFT doesn't hold money, doesn't move money, and doesn't touch a single dollar, since SWIFT is just messaging. Think of it like this, where a bank in London needs to send 10 million to Tokyo, and SWIFT sends the secure message between them while the actual money moves through other networks. But without SWIFT's messaging, international payments just stop dead in the water. Created back in 1973 by 239 banks across 15 countries to replace the old telex system that was slow, insecure, and constantly screwing up, SWIFT now in 2024 connects over 11,000 institutions in more than 200 countries with 45 million messages every day and $5 trillion moving through this thing daily. But here's the interesting part, where SWIFT's technically in Belgium and supposed to be neutral, except if you look at the board, it's American banks and European banks running it. And here's the real leverage, where most international transactions end up settling in dollars through New York eventually, so Treasury Department can just pressure SWIFT to disconnect whoever we want. You get cut off, and international trade becomes basically impossible because you're isolated. And we already tested this weapon back in 2012 on Iran, when Iranian banks got disconnected and their oil exports just collapsed because buyers couldn't pay them, leading to Iranian economy shrinking 9% in 1 year, with inflation hitting 45%. The sanctions forced them to the table, and the 2015 nuclear deal happened because of this, which looked like the perfect weapon. Except while everyone was celebrating, Iran was quietly building workarounds with barter deals with Turkey, crypto channels, and non-dollar trade with China and Russia. When sanctions came back in 2018, Iran did way better because they'd learned and weren't dependent on SWIFT anymore. Then February 2022 hits, and this wasn't Iran, but instead, this was Russia, with the 11th largest economy in the world, a nuclear superpower, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and a major energy exporter. Cutting Russia off wasn't just economic warfare anymore, but was a message that the US-controlled financial system can kick out anyone, anytime, for any political reason we decide. And every country watching got it instantly. How long's the US got can be estimated using Britain's timeline, where in 1914 Britain weaponized finance, seizing German assets, and in 1944 at Bretton Woods, the dollar replaced pound, representing 30 years from weaponization to replacement. But Britain also fought 2 devastating world wars, so weaponization alone didn't kill the pound, but was weaponization plus wars, plus economic disasters. And the US isn't fighting world wars while still having the largest economy, so decline might be slower. But tech accelerates everything now, where in 1914 building alternative systems took decades, but in 2024, CIPS scaled from 12 trillion to 24 trillion in 3 years, showing digital systems scale exponentially, meaning decline might actually be faster. Based on historical patterns and current acceleration, We're looking at 15 to 25 years from 2022, putting dollar collapse somewhere between 2037 and 2047. Not eliminated but no longer dominant, where dollar could fall from 58% today to maybe 35 to 40%. By 2040, still significant but not hegemonic. Euro, maybe 25%, yuan 20, and gold, and others 15 to 20, creating a multipolar currency world. Trajectories already set where dollar fell 13 points from 1999 to 2024 over 25 years. And at that rate, another 13 points gets us to 45% by 2049. But rates accelerating since the last 2 years saw a 4-point drop, meaning if that continues, we hit 45% by 2035. Timelines 10 to 25 years, not centuries, but 1 or 2 decades. Max. And what's that mean practically is that right now, US can run unlimited deficits because the world needs dollars, where foreign countries buy treasuries to get dollars, letting us borrow $2 trillion yearly at low rates, while we export inflation through dollar dominance. When dollar share falls below 40%, this advantage disappears where foreign demand for treasuries collapses. Interest rates spike, deficits become impossible, and US must balance budget or face serious inflation, as American living standard depends on importing more than we export, while paying with printed dollars becomes unsustainable, showing the free lunch is over. China wins massively as the obvious successor to US financial dominance, with second largest economy, largest manufacturing, largest trade volume, and yuan becoming reserve currency while CIPS is China's SWIFT. China holds massive gold reserves, likely over 4,000 tons despite official numbers, and Chinese tech like Alibaba and Tencent provide payment infrastructure rivaling Western systems, meaning as dollar declines, yuan rises naturally, where China doesn't need to militarily beat the US, but just wait for dollar to collapse under its own contradictions, accelerated by our weaponization. Russia wins strategically with smaller economy than China, but Russia proved you can survive swift cutoff, where demonstration effects crucial, since every country that feared US financial power now knows alternatives exist. Russia's survival destroyed the myth of US omnipotence, while Russia strengthened ties with China, India, and Iran, making them not isolated but center of alternative bloc. BRICS nations win, including Brazil, India, South Africa, and new members Saudi, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all benefiting from multipolar system where they gain leverage to play US, China, and EU against each other while not trapped in dollar dependence. India is the clearest example where they maintained Russia relations despite US pressure, bought Russian oil at discounts, settled in rupees, and faced no real consequences, showing that's the future for middle powers with more autonomy and less US dominance. Gold wins where countries lose trust in fiat and buy gold with central bank purchases at 50-year highs. And alternative payment systems win, including CIPS, SPFS, India's UPI, Brazil's PIX, and crypto, where anything allowing non-dollar transactions gains share, while fintech in China, India, and Russia benefits from Western system diversification. February 26, 2022, the nuclear option got deployed when major Russian banks were cut from SWIFT, and $300 billion in central bank reserves were frozen in Western institutions, representing unprecedented financial isolation. Immediate effect was dramatic, with the ruble crashing 30% in 2 days, Russian stock market having to close, and ATMs running out of cash with people panicking, while Western media is declaring victory, saying Russia will collapse in months. Then something unexpected happens, where Russia stabilizes as their central bank hikes rates to 20%, stopping the ruble's fall, and Russia demands Europe pay for gas in rubles, creating artificial demand for the currency. And within 3 months, the ruble recovered everything. Russian trade continued, just not through Western channels, as oil exports redirected to China, India, and Middle East, with trade settled in yuan, rupees, and rubles. And by late 2022, the economy stabilized, while by 2023, Russian GDP grew 3.6% faster than Germany and the UK. But the real damage wasn't to Russia, because the real damage was to the dollar and SWIFT, since every country watching understood the US will freeze reserves and cut SWIFT for political reasons. You're China, India, Saudi Arabia, or Brazil, And you're thinking, okay, we're not at war with America today, but what about tomorrow with Taiwan, Kashmir, Yemen, or trade policy? Because could the US freeze our trillion in reserves and cut us off? And the answer is obviously yes, since precedent's been set. So what did these countries do except exactly what Britain's enemies did in 1914 and what Iran's allies did in '79 by diversifying away from dollar and SWIFT while building alternatives? And that's when the five-stage backfire pattern kicked into absolute overdrive. Stage 1 is where the dominant power controls the payment system, like how, from 1973 to 2022, the US effectively controlled SWIFT, not directly since it's Belgian, but because most transactions settle in dollars through New York banks, giving us leverage where Treasury sanctions banks and Fed cuts dollar access, so SWIFT can't function without US cooperation. We control SWIFT by controlling the dollar, and the dollar dominates because of US economic and military power, which is the foundation. Stage 2 is weaponizing it for foreign policy, where from 2001 to 2022, we increasingly used financial sanctions starting after 9/11 targeting terrorist financing, then expanding to rogue states like Iran and North Korea, then Russia in 2014. And each escalation normalized financial warfare. By 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, using the SWIFT weapon seemed obvious because infrastructure's there, precedent's there, and political will's there. So we cut Russia off and froze $300 billion with maximum pressure. Stage 3 is where targets find alternatives, like how Russia couldn't use SWIFT, so they adapted by expanding SPFS, while CIPS, which is China's payment system, became the main channel for Russian trade, along with crypto for some stuff and barter for others. By 2024, 90% of Russia's BRICS trade was in local currencies, with Russia-China trade hitting $240 billion in 2023, almost entirely yuan and rubles, Russia-India trade mostly rupees, and Russia-UAE trade in dirhams, proving you can survive outside the system. Stage 4 is neutral countries hedging, which is the critical part because it's not just Russia finding alternatives, but dozens of countries that aren't sanctioned but might be someday, like how China saw what happened and cut US Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion to $780 billion by mid-2024, while massively increasing gold reserves. CIPS processed 175 trillion yen in 2024, up 43% from the year before, showing the system's exploding, and Saudi Arabia, who's been a US ally for 80 years, saw those reserves frozen and reconsidered everything. March 2023. Saudi Arabia announces they'll take yuan for oil sales to China, breaking the 50-year petrodollar monopoly. UAE started settling trade with India in rupees and dirhams, just bypassing dollars completely. And Brazil and Argentina are negotiating common currency. BRICS nations now, with 9 members, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, are developing shared payment systems. And even US allies are hedging, where the EU developed Instex as an alternative payment mechanism, while over 50 central banks now test alternatives to dollar SWIFT. This isn't anti-American, but instead is seeing $300 billion frozen with an executive order and realizing our reserves aren't safe. Stage 5 is where the original weapon loses power, which is where we are now, because SWIFT's still dominant, but declining as the dollar's share of global reserves fell to 57.7% first quarter 2025, compared to over 70% in early 2000s, representing a 13 percentage point drop of trillions in diversification. And it's accelerating where dollars share. Who loses starts with United States losing hegemony, not immediately or catastrophically, but gradually and irreversibly, where dollar reserve status is foundation of American power, allowing unlimited deficit spending, sanctions that work, and living beyond means. But as dominance fades, advantages disappear. Must balance budgets, military becomes unaffordable without unlimited borrowing, and living standards fall relative to world. Though doesn't mean America becomes poor, but means America becomes normal as a large, rich country but not hyperpower. Europe loses with us where European countries tied themselves to dollar system by joining sanctions against Russia, froze reserves, and cut Russia from SWIFT, which aligned with US but tied Europe to dollar decline. And Euro could be alternative, but Europe hasn't pursued that while following US leadership instead. As dollar declines, euro doesn't automatically rise, but yuan does, making Europe subordinate to both US and China. SWIFT loses relevance as Belgian company perceived as Western tool, where countries diversify away and reduce SWIFT usage so it won't disappear, but becomes one of several systems instead of dominant one. And revenue from transaction fees means as volume shifts to CIPS and SPFS, the business model weakens. Dollar holders lose wealth where anyone holding dollar assets faces devaluation, including treasuries and bank accounts with anything dollar-denominated, not through hyperinflation or overnight, but persistent 5 to 10% annual inflation, as dollar loses power versus other currencies and gold. Treasury paying 4% interest but losing 7% to inflation and devaluation creates negative real return, where investors flee, which accelerates decline. And American consumers lose purchasing power, where US imports more than exports with trade deficit about $800 billion yearly, only sustainable because foreigners accept dollars. When they stop, we must export more or import less, meaning fewer goods, higher prices, and lower standards, where typical household used to cheap Chinese goods, cheap oil, and cheap everything imported faces prices rising 20 to 30% over decade as dollar loses status. Timelines set where SWIFT weapon deployed 2022 triggered 5-stage pattern, and where stage 4 with neutral countries hedging aggressively, while stage 5 where weapon loses power is beginning now. By 2030 dollar share likely 50%, and by 2040 maybe 40 or lower, where US still has largest single share but no longer dominance, creating multipolar world where US is weaker for it. SWIFT weapon looked powerful. February 2022 with Russia cut, reserves frozen, and maximum pressure. But financial weapons work like nukes, where you use once and after, everyone builds defenses. Russia built alternatives, China accelerated CIPS, BRICS expanded, and petrodollar broke, making SWIFT weapon useless now because anyone we might target already built alternatives or building now. US could have maintained dominance through economic strength, free trade, and rule-based systems benefiting everyone, but instead chose weaponization by freezing assets, cutting SWIFT, and using dollar as coercion tool, which worked tactically against small countries like Iran, but against Russia backfired spectacularly. And backfires systemic, where not just Russia leaving, but half the world building alternatives, showing Britain weaponized 1914 and lost reserve currency 1944, while US weaponized 2022. And pattern says we lose dominance 2042. Maybe sooner because tech accelerates everything. This isn't speculation, but pattern recognition from historical cycles, where financial weapons always backfire, and dominant power thinks it's exercising ultimate leverage, but actually teaching world to build alternatives. And once alternatives exist, original system loses power permanently. SWIFT weapon destroyed SWIFT's monopoly, and dollar weapon destroyed dollar hegemony. Where country benefiting most is China as patient rival that watched America destroy its own advantages. China didn't defeat US militarily, and didn't need to because America defeated itself weaponizing tools of its own dominance, showing 5-stage patterns complete where US controlled SWIFT and dollar, weaponized them against Russia, Russia found alternatives, 50+ countries now hedging, and weapons losing power rapidly. This is end of dollar hegemony, not through dramatic collapse or military defeat, but financial miscalculation, where SWIFT weapon worked once and will never work again effectively because world learned the lesson to build alternatives, diversify from dollars, and never be vulnerable to US financial power again. Look, if you get that financial weapons backfire and recognize SWIFT cutoff marked, beginning of dollar decline, not peak of power, then you understand next 20 years of geopolitics where dollar declines, yuan rises, world becomes multipolar, and America's weaker not because of Chinese aggression but because of our policy choices. We had the golden goose and strangled it with sanctions, showing welcome to post-dollar world that's not fully here yet, but coming, where timelines set and patterns clear from history as SWIFT weapon was trigger. 20 years from now, historians look back at February 2022 as when American financial dominance ended, and they just didn't know it then. If this opened your eyes to something mainstream media won't touch, then smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to understand what's really happening. Subscribe because I'm tracking the exact data everyone else ignores and drop a comment telling me who you think wins biggest from de-dollarization, whether it's China, India, BRICS, or is there a dark horse nobody's talking about? I read every single comment, so let's figure out where this is really heading.